Good morning. I am obviously sitting in the aviary, kind of waiting to see if I have any new chicks that fledged today. And so while I'm doing that, I thought I would share some thoughts about quarantine that have been on my mind recently, if you've been watching the channel. And no, I don't have any new birds in quarantine yet or any information about that, but it has been on my mind a lot. And I see a lot of questions about it, and I see a lot of sort of incomplete information shared when people ask. And so I thought I would add more incomplete information, but maybe in a different way that's helpful. Okay, so the first thing is that I thought to mention is when you ask questions about quarantine, you always get a lot of different answers. And there's a good reason for that, and it's helpful to understand why. First of all, quarantine refers to bringing a bird into the family and isolating that bird away from other birds for some period of time. It sometimes involves treating them prophylactically or preventatively for that's Julius and Rain chicks. Can you hear them? I think so. Either that or it's my still two male strawberries. Sounds awfully quiet. It should be louder. Maybe they're in stealth mode. Okay. It's so helpful when I get distracted, isn't it? Okay. So it often involves, treating the birds preventatively for some things to try to make sure that they're healthy when you mix them into the flock. But that's not really all that quarantine is about. So the reason you get lots of different opinions is that when you're new to finches and you add some new family members, you tend to underestimate the value of the quarantine process until you get bit by something. And so people who have not had any bad experiences tend to undervalue or underestimate that step. And you have good reason. When you add new members to the family, you want to see them in the environment that you envision them in. Maybe you got them as friends for another bird. Maybe it's a partner for another bird, and you're curious to see how they get along. So there's tons of incentive to want to, get the birds, get them out of the box, and put them together, and skip over the quarantine step. And if you've never had a problem with it, then that's your perspective on it. And then the more you keep birds, you realize you may be getting lucky, and that it's not actually good practice to do that. So if you have ever had a problem, say, with mites, you're never going to make that mistake again, because treating, first of all, infecting your healthy birds with a preventable problem is not something you want to repeat. Sometimes some of this stuff is not easy to get back out of the environment once it's been introduced. And it's much more challenging, and, worst comes to worst, you have birds that get ill or even die unnecessarily. And so now your quarantine protocol is likely going to include treating for mites. And then maybe you start to do research and you realize, I don't really want coccidiosis or whatever, and then pretty soon there's a more elaborate and lengthier process in your quarantine, and then that's the advice you would give somebody. So that's worth taking seriously. Like, learn from other people's, mistakes, no matter how excited you are. And even if you're feeling guilty about, your bird has been shipped or just came out of quarantine, or your bird looks lonely or whatever, try to resist that thought process. And here's why. Quarantine is not just for the birds, to protect the birds that you already have. It's actually a really valuable process for the birds you are introducing as well, I think, and here's why I say that. When you move a bird from one situation to another, in terms of everything that's important to a bird, every single variable is different. Everything. The lighting is different. The duration of day is different. The food is different. The chemistry of the water is different. The routine is different. The noises are different. The temperature is different. The humidity is different. I could go on and on. Literally everything that matters to a bird is different. So when you also add them to a mix of other birds, now they have a whole nother set of things that they have to deal with. Hierarchies, personalities, relationships, pecking order, dominance, sexual advances from birds they're not ready for, etc. Aggression. So when you quarantine the birds that you bring in, the idea is you put them in a quiet spot by themselves with everything that they need so that they can first feel comfortable and confident that their basic needs are met while they process everything else that's new. They get to know you, they get to know your voice, your routine, how you move. They get to learn that you're safe. They get to learn, they know where food is, they know where water is, they're warm, they're protected, they're sheltered, they have a place to sleep. They're getting used to the timing, like all of a sudden the sun comes up and sets at totally different times than where they used to be. So they're getting used to that and the effects that has on their biology. So they get all that to happen. And they don't have to compete for food or space or bickering or whatever with other birds at the same time. Okay, so there's that. And then the other aspect of the quarantine is the whole, medication or concern about birds being ill. So let me talk about that a little bit. First of all, I don't think it's very smart to start throwing medications at a bird when you don't know whether they're necessary or what's going on. Some medications are pretty innocuous and there's not much. I think there's 3. Some medications are not terribly problematic, so it's not a bad thing to treat them, but it would be helpful to know if the person you got the birds from has already treated them for things, because doubling down on medications is not a good idea. So try to get that information when you acquire the birds. And if you don't have that information, consider that the breeder may have already treated them with Ronex last week, or for mites or whatever it is. Throwing antibiotics at birds is not necessarily a great idea. Maybe they need exactly the opposite. They need probiotics because they had antibiotics. So my advice, instead of immediately starting to medicate birds, would be to just give them a clean environment and a quiet environment and watch them and get to know your birds first. And if you see evidence that there's something problematic, first try to contact the person that you got them from. So if you go to a bird show, get their phone number, get their name and phone number, and make arrangements with them. Like, is it okay if I call you, or email or whatever? Can I call you if I have any questions? And I think most everybody I know would be perfectly happy to follow through so that they can be sure that their birds are doing well in their new situation. So that would be my recommendation. That's what I do. And then there are quarantine protocols. I would not ask for advice necessarily from social media, because I mentioned you're going to get a billion different ideas and it's going to be hard to filter through what advice you're getting. But a reputable published quarantine protocol would be worth investigating. If the bird is injured or molting or lethargic, or anything other than bright-eyed and active and singing and healthy, don't add them to the flock thinking that they're lonely or they'll be better once they have friends or whatever. Let them work through, or help them work through, whatever is going on, and then you can add them. It's actually a favor to that bird. It is not a favor to a bird who's not feeling well to make them deal with a new situation. Okay, so now, ultimately, when you do add them to the aviary or your flight cage or your friends, they are going to have to adapt to the other birds, but by that time, everything else, all those other variables that I mentioned, are now stable and understood by the bird and incorporated into their situation. So all they have to do now is find food and water, and which perching areas are available to them, and where they should stay away from in the aviary or whatever. And that's a much easier job for them to do. Plus, you now know that they're relaxed and comfortable and happy and healthy, and so dealing with that stuff is not as big a deal. I know, just a minute, guys. Okay, so duration. No pun intended. Why the duration? Why not 2 days? Why not a week? Okay. Purpose of length in the quarantine is sort of twofold. If you are medicating them or doing a series of medications, often you don't want to do all of that at once, and so you might say treat for worms and then give them time to recover, and then you might treat for something else, and then you give them time to recover, and then you treat for something else. So that creates a sequence of events that takes, say, 30 days. That's one reason. But there's another reason, and that is sometimes birds are carriers of a pathogen that is not a problem for that bird. And their immune system is dealing with that pathogen, and it never reaches a state where they are ill. And it really doesn't cause any problems for that bird, and it's not visible, there's no signs of it, everything seems fine. But then in times of stress, for example, when everything in their life gets thrown into upheaval because they move to a new situation, their immune system can become overwhelmed, and now this pathogen flourishes and becomes infectious. And the bird becomes sick and also becomes potentially infectious to other birds. So some of these pathogens have a life cycle that takes a while for it to manifest. So if you give, say, a 30-day quarantine, if there is anything percolating, then you will begin to see the bird who looks fine when you bring them home start to show signs of, might be puffy or sleeping or not eating properly, or the poop changes or whatever. And that gives you an opportunity to observe the bird and try to understand what's going on, potentially treat that before it gets introduced into a different environment. So that's the purpose of duration. Okay, sometimes I get questions about, should I quarantine birds individually or in groups, or how does that work? I would say that it is okay to quarantine compatible birds that have traveled together or come from the same breeder together. If you notice any strife between the birds, so sometimes birds are shipped together that will get along for a very short period of time in the shipping container, but they really need to be separated when they arrive. And that's something you can know in advance when you decide to purchase those birds. So, but assuming they're compatible, you can put groups of birds together. The downside to that is that if you start to notice something, which say it manifests in poop, somebody has runny poop, but you don't know who it is. As soon as you see something like that, it pays to separate the birds as best you can and isolate that bird as quickly as possible. So, so pros and cons. If every bird is completely separated, you can monitor each bird individually. I would not quarantine I would not quarantine a group of birds in such a big group that I cannot identify each bird individually, say by band. I think you could easily miss something important or developing in that case, or I would have trouble with that. So I wouldn't quarantine 20 birds together, for example. And I would also say that, when you go into the bird room or your living room or wherever the birds are, at first, they go in and they're going to all be active and agitated because you're in the room. Be sure you sit quietly, like a cup of coffee. Hang out, sit quietly, see what they do when you're not, when you haven't changed the energy in the room. Because that's when you're most likely to see if there's anything going on. Otherwise, it's in the bird's best interest to hide any ailment or injury as best they can. That's a survival instinct, and you can, potentially miss something. Hi guys, are you done with me talking and you'd like to eat now? I hope I will get a chance to. One other thing you might wonder about. When you import birds, they go through a quarantine depending on where they're coming from, but typically they go through at least a 21-day quarantine before they're shipped. Then they come through a USDA facility. That's a 30-day quarantine. There's that 30 days again, right? And then sometimes people say, well, they just came through quarantine. Should I quarantine them again? Yes, you should. So that's maybe my thinking about quarantine that may be helpful to you or help you think about it in a broader sense. Hi. You guys can just go down and eat if you want to,